The lawyer's hands were trembling as he placed the thick folder on my kitchen table. That was the first sign something was wrong, because lawyers don't shake. 5 days earlier, I had buried a secret worth $40 million, a secret powerful enough to destroy my entire family. Now my father's new wife Linda was standing in the middle of my living room with a smug smile on her face and a sharp-suited lawyer by her side. She looked at me like the game was already over. She thought she was about to take everything. She had no idea my grandfather had been planning for this moment for over a year. She had no idea he'd left me a loaded gun hidden in plain sight. And she had absolutely no idea she was about to go to war with the wrong woman. My name is Emily Dawson, and this is the story of how I protected my grandfather's legacy from the woman who married my father for money. I'd flown in from Fort Bliss 2 days before the ceremony, still carrying the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from jet lag, but from grief that hasn't finished landing. My grandfather, Walter Dawson, had passed away 6 weeks earlier, and I hadn't even had time to feel the shape of that loss before my father called to remind me the wedding was still happening. "Life goes on, Em," he'd said like that was supposed to comfort me. I remember standing on the tarmac at El Paso International, duffel bag over my shoulder, staring at my phone and wondering how a man could bury his own father and still send out save-the-date cards for a woman he'd known less than a year. Grandpa Walter raised me in every way that mattered. My mother left when I was 4, and my father worked long hours trying to build a construction business that never quite built itself. So it was Walter who packed my lunches, Walter who sat in the bleachers at every track meet, Walter who told me the night before I left for basic training that I had more steel in me than anyone he'd ever met, including himself. When he got sick 2 years ago, I requested every leave I could, flew home whenever the army would let me breathe, and sat beside his hospital bed reading him the newspaper because his eyes had grown too tired for the small print. My father visited twice. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it matters later. 3 days after the funeral, before I'd even repacked my dress uniform, Grandpa's attorney, a quiet, precise man named Harold Kessler, asked to meet me alone at his office downtown. I sat across from his mahogany desk, still numb, expecting maybe a keepsake, a watch, a letter. Instead, he slid a thick folder toward me and told me in that flat lawyer voice that tries not to sound dramatic, even when the news is enormous, that my grandfather had left me everything. $40 million. Investment portfolios. Business shares in 2 companies I didn't even know he owned. 3 properties, including the lake house where I'd spent every summer of my childhood catching fireflies in mason jars. I remember gripping the arms of that leather chair like the floor might tilt. "Does my father know?" I asked. Harold shook his head slowly. "Your grandfather left specific instructions. He asked that you tell no one, especially not your father, until you were certain the man he raised was still the man standing in front of you." He paused, watching me carefully. "He used those exact words, Emily. He said you'd understand what he meant." I didn't understand, not fully, not yet. But something cold moved through my chest anyway. Some instinct passed down from a man who had never once in his life said something without a reason, buried 3 layers beneath it. So I said nothing. I flew back to San Antonio for the wedding, put on the pale blue dress my grandfather always said matched my eyes, and I sat in the second row while my father married a woman named Linda Marsh. Linda was, I'll admit, striking. Late 40s, sharp cheekbones, the kind of laugh that made every man in the room turn his head, including mine, for entirely different reasons. She'd swept into my father's life 8 months after Grandpa's diagnosis, back when he was scared and lonely and desperate for someone to tell him everything would be fine. At the reception, she found me by the gift table, wrapped her manicured fingers around my forearm, and asked, with a smile stretched just a little too wide, whether my grandfather had left the family well taken care of. I told her I didn't know the details. It wasn't even entirely a lie yet. But I watched her that whole night, the way you watch weather rolling in on the horizon. She asked my father's business partner about probate timelines between bites of wedding cake. She cornered my aunt near the bar and asked casually whether Walter had ever mentioned a will. She hugged me for photos with her cheek pressed against mine and murmured just low enough for only me to hear, "Family should never keep secrets from family. Don't you think, sweetheart?" I smiled back and said nothing because some instincts you don't argue with, you simply obey. I flew back to base 3 days later, telling myself the wedding was over and the secret could stay buried a while longer, that Grandpa's caution had just been the fear of a dying man who trusted no one at the end. I told myself Linda's questions were nothing more than a new wife's nerves. I was wrong. Keeping Grandpa's secret felt wrong. From the very first night, a low hum of guilt I carried in my chest like a live wire. Until 5 days later, when I heard a knock at my apartment door, sharp and confident 3 times. I opened it to find Linda standing on my welcome mat in a cream-colored blazer, her lips curved into that same too-wide smile. Beside her stood a man I'd never seen before, holding a leather briefcase against his hip like a weapon. Linda didn't wait for an invitation. She walked past me into my apartment like she'd been there 100 times before, her heels clicking against my hardwood floor, her eyes sweeping the room in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like an appraisal. The man with the briefcase introduced himself as Gerald Finch, an attorney, and I remember how carefully he chose that word attorney, not my attorney, or our attorney, just attorney, floating out there like it belonged to no one and everyone. "This will only take a few minutes," Linda said, settling herself onto my couch without being asked, crossing her legs like she owned the cushions beneath her. "Gerald just wants to go over a few things." I stayed standing. Some part of me, some old instinct sharpened by years of standing at attention while superior officers tried to rattle me, told me that staying on my feet mattered here, that sitting down would mean something I wasn't ready to concede. Gerald opened his briefcase and slid a manila folder across my coffee table, the kind of gesture people make in movies right before they think they've won. Inside were photocopies of Texas inheritance statutes, sections highlighted in yellow paragraphs circled in blue ink. He cleared his throat and began explaining in the practiced cadence of a man who had rehearsed this speech in his car on the drive over, that as the only surviving child of the deceased, my father held certain rights to the estate that fairness, if not law, suggested should be honored. He used the word fairness 3 times in under 2 minutes. I counted. "Emily," Linda said, leaning forward, her voice dropping into something meant to sound gentle, "your father just lost his own father. He's grieving, too. And he's realizing that decisions were made without him ever being consulted. Don't you think as his daughter you have some obligation to make things right?" I let the silence stretch a beat longer than was comfortable, a trick I'd learned from watching Grandpa negotiate with contractors who tried to lowball him. Then I said as evenly as I could manage, "I don't understand what you're asking me to make right. I wasn't left anything." Linda's smile flickered just barely, like a light bulb catching a power surge. "That's not what we've heard." "From who?" "Does it matter?" Gerald cut in smoothly. "What matters is transparency. If there's truly nothing to discuss, you'd have no issue signing an affidavit confirming you received no inheritance from your grandfather's estate." And there it was, the trap dressed up in a suit and a briefcase. I looked at that folder, at the affidavit clipped to the back of it, and I understood with sudden clarity that signing it would either be a lie under oath or a confession, depending on which lie I was more afraid of. "I'm not signing anything today," I said. "If you have questions about my grandfather's estate, you can direct them to his attorney, Harold Kessler. I'm sure you already have his information since you seem to have done your research." Something shifted in Linda's face, then something quick and hard beneath the makeup, gone almost before I registered it. Gerald closed his briefcase with a soft click, the kind of sound that felt more like punctuation than surrender. "We'll be in touch," Linda said, standing smoothing the front of her blazer. At the door she paused, turning back to look at me with an expression I'd remember for a long time afterward, something between pity and warning. "Your grandfather always did like keeping his cards close, didn't he? Guess it runs in the family." I didn't answer. I just held the door until they were both gone, and then I stood in my own living room for a long moment, listening to my heart pound against my ribs like something trying to escape. The second they left, I called Harold. He picked up on the second ring, and when I told him what had just happened word for word, I heard him go quiet in that particular way. People go quiet when they're deciding how much truth to share. "Emily," he finally said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to stay calm while I do." "Go ahead." 2 days ago, someone contacted my office claiming to be a paralegal doing routine estate verification. They asked detailed questions about your grandfather's will, specifically about beneficiary designations. My assistant almost gave them information before I caught the call myself. He paused. "It wasn't a paralegal, Emily. There's no law firm by that name registered anywhere in the state." My mouth went dry. Someone tried to access the will directly. "Someone tried very hard," Harold said, "and whoever it was knew exactly what questions to ask to sound legitimate. This wasn't a guess, Emily. This was research." I thought about Linda at the reception asking my aunt about probate timelines, cornering my father's business partner between bites of cake. I thought about the way her eyes had swept my apartment when she walked in, cataloging, measuring the way a burglar cases a house before deciding which window to break. That was when I remembered the small black dome mounted above my doorframe, the security camera Grandpa had insisted I install, after a string of break-ins hit my apartment complex 2 years back. I'd almost forgotten it was there. I pulled up the footage on my laptop that night, hands trembling slightly as I scrubbed through the timestamp from the visit. And there it was, clear as daylight, something I hadn't noticed in the moment, because I'd been too focused on Gerald's folder and Linda's questions. While Gerald had been distracting me with statutes and affidavits, Linda had lifted her phone twice, angling it toward my bookshelf, toward the framed photo of me and Grandpa at the lake house, toward the corner of my desk, where old mail sat in a small wooden tray. She wasn't just visiting. She was photographing my home like a woman building a case file. The days after that visit moved faster than I expected, and not in a direction that gave me any comfort. My father started calling within 48 hours, and the first few calls I let go to voicemail, partly because I was still stationed and pulled into briefings, and partly because I needed time to figure out what version of my father I was about to be talking to. When I finally picked up on the third day, his voice sounded different than I remembered, tighter somehow, like something had been wound too far. "Emily, we need to talk about the estate," he said, skipping past hello entirely. "There's nothing to talk about, Dad. I told Linda that already." "Don't do this," he said, and I could hear something underneath the words, not quite anger, something closer to desperation dressed up as authority. "Linda says you're hiding something from me. She says Dad left you money and you're keeping it a secret." I closed my eyes, standing in the hallway outside the mess hall, feeling the weight of every year I'd spent, trying to be a good daughter, pressing down on my chest. "Linda says a lot of things," I answered carefully. "Have you asked yourself why she's so focused on this? She's my wife, Emily. She's looking out for our family. Our family. 2 months into a marriage, and already Linda was speaking through my father's mouth about our family, as if she'd earned some claim to a name she'd only just started borrowing. The calls didn't stop after that. They multiplied. Texts arrived at odd hours, my father's number lighting up my phone screen with messages that grew shorter and colder as the days passed. "We need an answer. Linda thinks you should meet with her lawyer. This is tearing the family apart, Em." I remember staring at that last one for a long time, thinking about the irony buried inside it, that the family being torn apart was being torn by the very woman claiming to hold it together. Then things stopped being just phone calls. I got an alert from my bank on a Tuesday morning, a routine security notification informing me that someone had attempted to verify my identity through customer service, using information that was almost right but not quite a birth date off by 2 digits, an old address I hadn't lived at in 6 years. The representative had denied the request, but the attempt itself sat in my stomach like a stone. 2 days later, Harold called again, his voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. Someone submitted a request to my office. He said, "A document claiming to be a power of attorney supposedly signed by you authorizing release of estate information to a third party." "I never signed anything like that." "I know," Harold said. "The signature didn't match anything on file, It was a forgery, and not a particularly good one, but someone tried. I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, feeling something cold settle into the marrow of my bones. This wasn't a grieving stepmother asking uncomfortable questions at a wedding anymore. This was a campaign methodical and patient, aimed squarely at prying open a door that had been sealed shut by a dying man's final wish. So I did what any soldier does when the enemy's position is unclear. I gathered intelligence. I called my cousin Rachel, who worked in records management and had, over the years, developed something of a talent for finding information that wasn't supposed to be easy to find. I asked her carefully to look into Linda Marsh's history, and I told myself I wasn't being paranoid. I was being thorough the same way Grandpa had taught me to check every load-bearing wall before trusting a house to stand. What Rachel found over the next several days made my stomach turn in a slow, sickening way. Linda had been married twice before my father. Her first marriage lasted 4 years to a man named Robert Callahan, who had owned a small chain of auto parts stores in Ohio. Court records showed a divorce filing that described in dry legal language allegations of misappropriated business funds and a settlement that left Robert selling off 2 of his 3 locations. Her second marriage, 5 years later, was to a retired dentist named Frank Delgado in Arizona, a man 12 years her senior with a modest but comfortable retirement portfolio. That marriage lasted just under 3 years, and the divorce filing included a civil suit Frank had brought against Linda, directly alleging that she had attempted to have him declared incompetent in order to gain control of his finances. The suit had been settled quietly out of court with a confidentiality clause that Rachel could only partially uncover. I sat at my kitchen table that night with printouts spread in front of me like battlefield maps, feeling the shape of something horrifying come into focus. 2 marriages. 2 older, financially comfortable men. 2 divorces that left both of them poorer, and Linda somehow always positioned just outside the reach of real consequence. This wasn't a woman who had simply fallen in love with my father at the wrong time. This was a pattern. I thought about the way she'd looked at my bookshelf, my photographs, my mail cataloging my life like a woman casing a target, rather than getting to know family. I thought about Gerald Finch's folder full of statutes, about the forged power of attorney, about the fake paralegal call to Harold's office. And I thought with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its coldness about how much my grandfather must have suspected or known long before any of us saw it coming. Because a man like Walter Dawson didn't leave $40 million behind a locked door with a warning attached, unless he already knew exactly what kind of storm was circling his family. I picked up my phone and called Harold one more time that night. "I need everything you have," I told him. "Every document, every note, anything Grandpa left with you that I haven't seen yet." I think he knew this was coming. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that carries weight. "Emily," Harold finally said, "there's a box. Your grandfather asked me to hold on to it and only give it to you if things escalated. I think it's time you came in and saw what's inside." Harold's office smelled the way it always had, old paper and coffee gone slightly bitter in the pot. And when I walked in that Thursday afternoon, he was already standing behind his desk with a wooden box in his hands, the kind with brass hinges and a small keyhole, the kind that looks like it belongs in an attic rather than a law office. He set it down gently like it held something fragile, though I already suspected nothing inside it was fragile at all. "Your grandfather brought this to me 8 months before he passed," Harold said, sliding a small brass key across the desk. "He told me to keep it locked away and only hand it to you if, in his words, things start to look the way I think they will." My hands weren't quite steady as I turned the key. Inside I found a leather-bound journal, a stack of handwritten letters tied with twine, a manila envelope thick with paper, and a small flash drive taped to the underside of the lid. I asked Harold if I could use his office alone for a while, and he nodded without a word, closing the door softly behind him. The journal was the first thing I opened. Grandpa's handwriting, slanted and familiar across the pages, the same handwriting that used to write my name on birthday cards and lunch bag notes when I was small. The early entries were dated back nearly a year and a half, not long after my father had first mentioned Linda's name to him over a Sunday dinner. I remember Grandpa telling me once offhand that something about the way she asked questions felt rehearsed. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Reading his private words now, I understood he'd thought about it constantly. Walter came home from meeting her family last night, one entry read, and told me she has no siblings, no children, and very little family to speak of. Yet, somehow she always seems to know exactly how much a man is worth within the first few conversations. I don't like it. I've seen this before in men who circle a business right before it goes under. They don't smell success. They smell vulnerability. Further in the entries grew more specific, more deliberate. Grandpa had hired a private investigator, a retired detective named Samuel Ortiz, to look quietly into Linda's background almost a full year before my father proposed. The manila envelope held Ortiz's full report, complete with court documents from both prior marriages' financial records, showing the steady erosion of both husbands' assets during their marriages to her, and photographs dated and time-stamped, of Linda meeting privately with a man named Gerald Finch on 3 separate occasions months before she ever appeared at a Dawson family dinner. Gerald Finch, the same lawyer who had sat on my couch with his folder of statutes. I sat back in Harold's leather chair, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath me the way it had the day I first learned about the inheritance. The flash drive held a single video file, and when I pressed play, my grandfather's face filled the small laptop screen, thinner than I remembered him in his final months, but his eyes were sharp, steady, unmistakably his. "Emily, if you're watching this," he said, his voice low, and measured the same voice that used to read me bedtime stories on the porch of the lake house. "Then Linda has already started. I wish I could tell you I was wrong about her. I wish more than anything that your father found a woman who loved him for the right reasons. But I've lived a long time, sweetheart, and I've learned that some people don't change what they are, they only change what they're wearing." He paused on the recording, and I watched him look down for a moment, gathering himself before looking back into the camera with an intensity that made my chest ache. "I had Samuel follow her for months. I have records of every man before your father, every dollar that disappeared, every court filing that got quietly settled before anyone could ask too many questions in public. I recorded conversations I probably shouldn't have, but I needed proof, not suspicion, because suspicion alone would never be enough to protect this family. I know she'll come for the inheritance eventually. I know she'll convince your father that you're the villain in this story, that you're selfish, that you're hiding something from him out of greed. She's done it before, Emily, to other men, other families. It's not clumsy, it's a method she's perfected. I left everything to you because you're the only one who never once asked me how much I was worth. You sat with me in that hospital room reading me the newspaper because you loved me, not because you were counting down the days until I was gone. That's rare, sweetheart. Rarer than money. And I need you to protect it, not just for yourself, but for your father too, whether he realizes it yet or not. There's a folder in this box with everything Samuel found. Use it if you have to. Don't use it out of anger. Use it because it's true and because someone has to stop this before she does to your father what she's already done to 2 other men." The recording ended there, the screen going dark, and I sat in the silence of Harold's office for what felt like a long time, staring at my own reflection in the blank laptop screen. My grandfather hadn't just protected me with money. He'd built an entire case patiently, methodically, the way he used to build houses, laying one board carefully atop another, until the whole structure could withstand a storm. He'd seen this coming from the very beginning, long before Linda ever wore a wedding dress, and stood beside my father at the altar, long before Gerald Finch sat on my couch, pretending to be a stranger to her. I gathered every document back into the box, closed the lid gently, and turned the small brass key until I heard it click. Whatever Linda thought she was walking into, she had no idea the war had already been fought and documented months before she ever knocked on my door. The lawsuit arrived exactly 9 days later, delivered by a process server who caught me just as I was leaving the base gym, my hair still damp, my gym bag slung over one shoulder. He handed me a thick envelope with the kind of practiced indifference that comes from doing this job too many times to feel anything about it anymore, and I stood in the parking lot reading the caption at the top of the first page. Linda Dawson versus Emily Dawson. She'd taken my father's last name already, wearing it like armor, like proof of belonging she hadn't quite earned yet. The complaint alleged that I had knowingly concealed a family inheritance from my father, that I had breached some vague and mostly invented duty of familial disclosure, and that the court should compel me to reveal the full extent of my grandfather's estate and distribute a fair share to my father as his only surviving child. Reading it, I felt something strange settle over me. Not fear exactly. More like the calm that comes right before a training exercise you've already rehearsed 100 times in your head. Harold met me at his office that same evening, and together we read through the filing line by line. "This isn't a strong complaint," he said, tapping the pages with 2 fingers. "There's no legal duty requiring you to disclose an inheritance to anyone, let alone share it. But that's not really the point, is it?" "No," I said. "The point is to force discovery. She wants a court order that makes me show my financial records under oath." Harold nodded slowly. "Exactly. She's trying to get a judge to do what forged power of attorney forms and fake paralegal calls couldn't." The mediation hearing was scheduled for the following month, and in the weeks leading up to it, my father called more than he had in years, sometimes twice a day, his voice sliding between pleading and accusation depending on the hour. "You're humiliating this family," he told me once late on a Sunday night. "Linda says you're treating her like a criminal. She hired a man named Gerald Finch to draft a fake power of attorney with my forged signature." I said, keeping my voice level. "Do you know that, Dad? Do you know she was meeting with a lawyer before she ever met you?" There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. "You don't know what you're talking about," he finally said, though something in his voice had gone thin, uncertain, like a man repeating a line he no longer fully believed. I didn't push further. Grandpa's voice echoed in my memory, telling me not to use what I had out of anger, only when it mattered, only when it was true. So I waited. The mediation room was small, fluorescent lit, the kind of space designed to feel neutral, but somehow always feels heavier than a courtroom. Linda arrived in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back severely, Gerald Finch beside her carrying the same leather briefcase from my living room. My father sat next to her, not next to me, and I felt that placement land somewhere deep in my chest even though I'd expected it. The mediator, a retired judge named Constance Reyes, opened by asking Linda's side to state their position. Gerald stood and delivered a version of the same speech he'd given in my apartment, dressed up now in more formal language words like equitable distribution and familial obligation, doing a lot of heavy lifting for a case that had no real legal foundation beneath it. When it was our turn, Harold didn't raise his voice. He never did. He simply opened his own folder and began calmly laying documents on the table one by one. First came the audio recordings. Samuel Ortiz had gathered Linda's voice captured in a diner months before she ever met my father, discussing with Gerald Finch how to position herself with a man whose adult daughter, quote, clearly has money coming given the grandfather's health. I watched my father's face as the recording played through the small speaker Harold had brought, watched something crack slightly behind his eyes. Then came the court records from Ohio and Arizona, the 2 prior marriages, the settlements the civil suit Frank Delgado had filed, alleging Linda tried to have him declared mentally incompetent to seize control of his assets. Judge Reyes read through those pages slowly, her expression unreadable but her pen moving steadily, taking notes. Then came the forged power of attorney document laid beside a certified handwriting analysis confirming the signature wasn't mine, alongside phone records showing calls placed from Gerald Finch's office to my bank's customer service line. On the same day, someone had tried to verify my identity using an incorrect birth date. Linda's confident smile, the one I'd watched flicker only once before in my apartment, began to fade in real time, replaced by something tighter, more brittle. She leaned over and whispered something to Gerald, who shook his head almost imperceptibly, the universal gesture of a lawyer realizing his client had walked him into a losing hand. I still hadn't said how much money was actually involved. Not the $40 million, not the properties, not the business shares. Harold and I had agreed beforehand that revealing the exact figures would only feed the narrative that this was about greed rather than truth. Instead, we let the pattern speak for itself. The recordings, the prior marriages, the forgeries, each piece settling onto the table like another board nailed into place, exactly the way Grandpa had built it. Months before any of us sat in this room, Judge Reyes finally set down her pen, and looked directly at Linda. "Mrs. Dawson," she said, her voice even, but carrying a weight that filled the small room. "I want to be very clear about something. This mediation was framed as a dispute about family fairness. What I'm looking at appears to be something else entirely." Linda's jaw tightened. My father stared down at the table, his hands pressed flat against the wood like he was trying to hold himself steady. For the first time since the wedding, I watched doubt take root in his face, small and reluctant, but undeniably there. The mediation recessed for the day without a ruling Judge Reyes, stating simply that she wanted time to review everything submitted before continuing, and the silence that followed her leaving the room felt heavier than anything spoken aloud. Linda gathered her things quickly, her movements sharp and clipped, refusing to look at anyone as Gerald guided her out with a hand at her elbow. My father lingered behind, and for a moment I thought he might walk out without a word too. Instead, he turned to me in the hallway outside. His face pale under the fluorescent lights, older somehow than I remembered him looking even at Grandpa's funeral. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Just the two of us." We found a small conference room down the hall, empty, the kind of space with a table too large for two people and chairs that scraped loudly against tile when you pulled them out. He sat across from me, running a hand through his hair, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. "You owe me an explanation," he finally said, though the certainty in his voice from the phone calls weeks earlier had thinned considerably. "You owe me the truth about what Dad left you." I looked at him steadily, feeling something old and tired rise up in my chest, not quite anger, something closer to exhaustion. "I don't owe you anything, Dad, but I'll ask you something instead. When Grandpa was in the hospital those last 8 months, where were you?" He blinked, caught off guard by the shift. "I was working. You know how busy the business gets." "You visited twice," I said quietly. "I counted because I was there almost every week. I sat with him during chemo. I drove him to appointments when his hands shook too badly to grip the steering wheel. I read him the newspaper because his eyes had gotten too tired for small print. Where were you exactly during all of that?" His mouth opened, then closed again. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, steady and indifferent. "I was grieving in my own way," he finally said, though the words sounded thin even as he spoke them, like a shirt worn too many times, the fabric gone soft and unconvincing. "Grandpa didn't leave me this money as some kind of prize, Dad. He left it to me because I showed up, because I never once asked him what he was worth, not when he was healthy, not when he was dying. I was just there." My voice cracked slightly on that last word, and I let it because some things deserve to be said honestly, even when honesty costs you something. Harold had given me one more piece from the box before I left his office weeks earlier, a letter Grandpa had written specifically for this moment, sealed, and marked only with the words, "For my son, if it comes to this." I'd carried it with me to the mediation, uncertain if I'd ever need it, hoping I wouldn't. Now I slid the envelope across the table. My father opened it with hands that weren't quite steady, and I watched his eyes move across his own father's handwriting, watched his jaw tighten and release as he read. "Son," the letter began, and though I'd already read it myself back in Harold's office, watching my father encounter those words for the first time felt like witnessing something private and painful, a door opening onto a room he'd avoided his whole life. "If you're reading this, it means the woman you married has done exactly what I feared she would do, and it means you're only now beginning to see it clearly. I don't say this with anger toward you. I say it with the sadness of a father who watched his son become so hungry for comfort after your mother left that he stopped asking the harder questions about the people who offer it. I left everything to Emily not because I don't love you, but because inheritance should never be a reward for blood alone. It should go to the person who showed up, who sat beside me without asking what she'd get for it, who loved me simply because I was her grandfather, not because of what I owned. You know who that person is. You've always known, even if you haven't wanted to admit it. This money isn't a prize, son. It's a responsibility. I've given it to the one person I trust to carry that responsibility honestly. I hope in time you'll understand that protecting Emily from Linda isn't a betrayal of you. It's the last gift I have left to give either of you." My father set the letter down slowly, his hands trembling now in a way that had nothing to do with age. He stared at the table for a long moment, and when he finally looked up at me, his eyes were wet, red-rimmed, older than I'd ever seen them. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know he saw all of this coming." "He saw it before either of us did," I said. "That's what love looks like sometimes. Not blind trust. Clear eyes." He didn't respond right away. He sat there folding and unfolding the corner of the letter, and for the first time since the wedding, I watched something shift behind his expression. Not full understanding yet, but the beginning of it, cracking open slowly, like ice under weight it could no longer bear. "What happens now?" he finally asked. "Now," I said, standing and gathering my things. "You decide whether you want to keep believing her or whether you're ready to see what the rest of us have already seen." I left him sitting there in that too large conference room, the letter still open in front of him, his father's handwriting staring back at him like a mirror he'd spent months refusing to look into. The final hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later, and by the time it arrived, something in the air around my father had changed in ways I hadn't expected. He called me the week before, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in years, and asked if he could speak at the hearing, not for Linda, he said, but to correct something he needed to correct in front of everyone, including himself. I walked into the courtroom that morning wearing my dress uniform, not because I needed the formality, but because some part of me wanted Grandpa's memory represented by the version of me he'd been proudest of, the soldier who showed up, who didn't run from hard things. Harold sat beside me with his folder thinner now, since most of what mattered had already been entered into the record during mediation. Linda arrived without Gerald Finch beside her this time, represented instead by a younger associate from his firm who looked distinctly uncomfortable, holding a case file he clearly hadn't built himself. Judge Reyes opened by summarizing what the court had reviewed since mediation, her voice measured and unhurried. She noted in careful legal language that the evidence presented the recorded conversations the pattern established across 2 prior marriages, the forged power of attorney document, the falsified identity verification attempt at my bank, painted a picture entirely inconsistent with a grieving stepmother seeking fairness. She stated plainly that the court found no legal basis whatsoever for compelling disclosure or distribution of my grandfather's estate, and that the plaintiff's claims were dismissed in their entirety. Then her expression hardened slightly, and she added that given the volume of evidence suggesting fraud, forgery, and possible attempted identity theft, she was referring the entire matter to the appropriate investigative authorities for further review, separate and apart from this civil proceeding. Linda's young attorney stood almost immediately requesting to withdraw from representation, citing what he called irreconcilable conflicts. And I watched Linda's face as he said it, watched the last thread of composure she'd been holding on to finally give way. She didn't cry, not in that dramatic way people sometimes imagine. She simply sat very still, staring at the table in front of her, looking for the first time since I'd met her genuinely small. My father asked to speak before the judge dismissed the room, and Judge Reyes granted him a brief moment. He stood slowly buttoning his jacket with hands I noticed were no longer trembling the way they had in that conference room weeks earlier. "I want the court to know," he said, his voice unsteady but clear, "that my daughter never once asked me or anyone in this family for anything. Not money, not recognition, nothing. She showed up for my father when I didn't, and I let someone convince me that made her the villain instead of the truth. Which is that I failed to show up, and I let my guilt get twisted into something ugly aimed at the wrong person." He turned to look at me, then his eyes glassy. "I'm sorry, Emily. I should have said that a long time before any of this happened in a courtroom." I didn't answer him right away, not out of coldness, but because some apologies need room to exist without immediately being filled with forgiveness or absolution. Judge Reyes nodded, once said something about hoping the family could find its way back to something whole, and adjourned the hearing. Outside on the courthouse steps, my father caught up with me before I reached my car. "Can we start over?" he asked, not pretending none of this happened. "Just, starting from wherever we actually are now. We can try, I said, and I meant it, though I knew trying would take longer than a single conversation on a courthouse staircase. In the months that followed, Linda disappeared from our lives almost entirely. The investigation into the forged documents moving forward quietly through channels I didn't need to track closely. Harold assuring me the matter was being handled by people whose job it was to handle exactly this kind of thing. My father filed for divorce within weeks, and though he grieved that ending in his own way, I noticed something in him afterward that hadn't been there in years. A kind of clarity, like a man waking up from a fog he hadn't realized he'd been standing in. I didn't take revenge the way Linda might have expected if she'd ever bothered to imagine what I was capable of. I didn't publicly humiliate her beyond what her own choices had already exposed. I didn't gloat, and I didn't let anger become the shape of who I was afterward. Grandpa hadn't left me $40 million so I could become someone who needed to win at other people's expense. He'd left it to me so I'd have the freedom to build something worth protecting. I used part of the inheritance to establish a